Good evening, and welcome to Truth Report. I'm Alex Truth, and tonight we are covering a story that could reshape the American economy and the balance of power between the White House and Congress. The Supreme Court has just handed down a landmark ruling on presidential tariff authority, and the implications are staggering.
I'm Maya Clarity, and Alex, this is one of those rulings that sounds dry on the surface as tariffs, trade law, statutory interpretation, but underneath, it is an earthquake. We're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars, thousands of potential lawsuits, and a fundamental question about whether a president can unilaterally wage economic war without congressional approval.
That's exactly right. So let's get into it. On February 20, 2026, the Supreme Court ruled that President Trump's imposition of sweeping tariffs under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, known as IEEPA, was not legal. The court found that IEEPA does not grant the president the authority to impose tariffs unilaterally by declaring an economic emergency.
And to understand why this matters so much, you have to understand what IEEPA actually is and how it was being used. IEEPA was passed in 1977. It gives the president broad powers to regulate international commerce during a declared national emergency. It was designed for genuine crises, think sanctions against hostile nations, freezing assets of terrorist organizations. It was never intended as a blank check for trade policy.
But that's exactly how the Trump administration used it. Rather than going through Congress to pass tariff legislation, which is how tariffs are supposed to work under Article 1 of the Constitution, the administration declared various trade imbalances to be national emergencies and then slapped tariffs on goods from countries around the world. We're talking about tariffs on Canadian goods, Mexican goods, Chinese imports, European products. The scope was enormous.
According to reporting from CleanTechnica, the estimated financial impact of these tariffs runs to roughly $175 billion. That is not a small number. That is money that was collected from American importers, passed on to American consumers through higher prices, and in many cases devastated small and medium businesses that relied on international supply chains. Every dollar of that is now potentially subject to legal challenge.
Let's break down the legal reasoning here, because it matters. The court essentially said that while IEEPA grants broad emergency powers, those powers do not include the power to levy tariffs. Tariffs are taxes. And under the Constitution, the power to tax belongs to Congress. The president cannot simply bypass Congress by labeling a trade dispute a national emergency and then imposing what are effectively taxes on imported goods.
This is a separation of powers issue at its core, Alex. And what's remarkable is that this has been building for years. Legal scholars have been warning since the first round of IEEPA-based tariffs that this was constitutionally dubious. Trade lawyers were filing challenges. Business groups were sounding alarms. But the political dynamics made it very difficult for Congress to act, because opposing tariffs was framed as being soft on trade rivals, particularly China.
And that political framing is important to understand. The tariffs were sold to the American public as a way to protect American workers and punish unfair trade practices. And look, there are legitimate concerns about trade imbalances and unfair practices by some trading partners. Nobody disputes that. But the question was never whether trade policy should exist. The question was whether one person in the Oval Office should be able to set trade policy unilaterally, without congressional debate, without economic impact analysis, without any of the checks that are supposed to exist in our system.
And the Supreme Court has now answered that question with a definitive no. But here's where it gets really interesting, and really consequential. This ruling opens the floodgates for litigation. We are talking about potentially thousands of lawsuits from businesses that paid these tariffs, from importers who saw their costs skyrocket, from companies that had to lay off workers or shut down entirely because their supply chains were disrupted by tariffs that, as of this ruling, were never legally imposed in the first place.
Think about what that means in practical terms. If you're a small manufacturer in Ohio who imports steel components, and your costs went up 30% because of IEEPA tariffs, and you had to cut your workforce, you now have a legal basis to seek compensation. If you're an agricultural exporter who lost access to foreign markets because of retaliatory tariffs triggered by the IEEPA actions, you have a case. The scale of potential claims is almost incomprehensible.
And this is where the $175 billion figure comes in. That's an estimate of the total tariffs collected under these IEEPA declarations. Now, not all of that will necessarily be refunded. The legal process will be complex. There will be arguments about standing, about damages, about procedural issues. But even a fraction of that number represents an enormous financial liability for the federal government.
Let's talk about who actually bore the cost of these tariffs, because there's been a persistent myth that tariffs are paid by foreign countries. They are not. Tariffs are paid by the importer, the American company bringing goods into the country. And those costs are then passed along through the supply chain, ultimately landing on American consumers in the form of higher prices. Study after study has confirmed this. The tariffs functioned as a regressive tax on American consumers and businesses.
That's a critical point. And it connects to a broader pattern we've seen, where policies are sold with populist rhetoric: we're going to make China pay, but the actual economic burden falls on working and middle-class Americans. The farmer in Iowa whose soybean exports collapsed. The small retailer in Georgia whose inventory costs went through the roof. The construction company in Texas that couldn't afford steel. These are the people who paid for this policy, and they're the people who now have the strongest claims for relief.
Now, I want to get into the political dynamics of this ruling, because they are fascinating and complicated. This Supreme Court, let's remember, has a 6-3 conservative majority. Several of these justices were appointed by President Trump himself. So this is not a case of liberal judicial activism, as it will inevitably be framed by some. This is a conservative court applying conservative legal principles, namely, that executive power has limits and that Congress has constitutional prerogatives that the president cannot simply override.
And that's what makes this ruling so significant from a constitutional perspective. There has been a growing concern among legal scholars on both the left and the right about the expansion of executive emergency powers. Presidents of both parties have used emergency declarations to bypass Congress on everything from military spending to immigration policy to trade. This ruling draws a line and says there are boundaries to what a president can do under the guise of emergency authority.
The IEEPA statute itself is going to come under intense scrutiny now. Congress passed it almost 50 years ago, in a very different geopolitical and economic environment. The question is whether Congress will now act to either clarify the law, narrow it, or potentially expand it with explicit tariff authority, which would be a very different thing, because it would involve congressional debate, amendment, and accountability.
And that gets to one of the most important implications of this ruling: the potential for congressional reassertion of its trade authority. For decades, Congress has been delegating more and more power to the executive branch, and this isn't just a Trump issue. This is a structural issue in American governance. Congress has found it politically convenient to let the president make tough trade decisions so that individual members don't have to take difficult votes. This ruling may force Congress back into the arena.
Let's talk about the international implications as well, because they are enormous. American trade partners have been dealing with whiplash for years. Tariffs imposed, then modified, then escalated, then partially rolled back, all by executive fiat. This unpredictability has been devastating for international business relationships and has undermined trust in the United States as a reliable trading partner. This ruling could actually help stabilize those relationships by establishing that trade policy must go through a more deliberative and predictable legislative process.
But there's a flip side to that, Alex. In the short term, this creates even more uncertainty. Businesses don't know which tariffs are still in effect, which will be rolled back, what the litigation timeline looks like. Companies that have already reorganized their supply chains around the tariffs now face the prospect of another disruption. The transition period is going to be messy, and someone needs to be honest about that.
Absolutely. And we should talk about the enforcement question. What happens to tariffs that are currently being collected? Does this ruling mean they stop immediately? The court's order will need to be interpreted and implemented, and there will likely be a period where the administration seeks to comply, or, potentially, seeks workarounds. We've seen this pattern before, where a court strikes down an executive action and the administration looks for alternative legal authorities to achieve the same goal.
That is a real concern. The administration could potentially try to reimpose some tariffs under different statutory authority, Section 301 of the Trade Act, for example, or Section 232 on national security grounds. Those authorities have their own legal vulnerabilities, but they haven't been addressed by this particular ruling. So we could see a game of legal whack-a-mole where tariffs are struck down under one authority and reimposed under another.
And that's why this ruling, as significant as it is, may be just the beginning of a much larger legal and political battle over trade authority. The fundamental question is whether trade policy in the United States will be made by one person or by the elected representatives of the American people acting through Congress. That is a question that goes to the heart of our constitutional system.
Let's also examine who benefits from this ruling and who loses, because that tells you a lot about the underlying power dynamics. The immediate beneficiaries are American businesses that have been paying these tariffs, importers, manufacturers who rely on foreign components, retailers. The consumer ultimately benefits if tariff costs are rolled back and prices come down. But there's a lag in that. Prices went up quickly when tariffs were imposed, but they tend to come down much more slowly when tariffs are removed. That's just the reality of how markets work.
On the other side, domestic industries that were protected by the tariffs could face renewed competition. If you're a U.S. steel producer who benefited from tariffs on imported steel, this ruling is bad news for your bottom line. And the workers in those industries are caught in the middle of a policy whipsaw that they had no control over. This is why trade policy needs to be made carefully, deliberately, and with full consideration of the impacts, not by emergency declaration.
And let's not forget the political class. There are politicians who built their brands on tariff as weapon rhetoric, who told their constituents that tariffs were making America stronger. This ruling is a repudiation of that approach, at least in legal terms. How they spin it politically will be fascinating to watch, but the legal reality is clear: the way these tariffs were imposed was not lawful.
Now, I want to zoom out and talk about the broader pattern here, because this ruling doesn't exist in a vacuum. We have been watching, for years now, an escalating tension between executive power and constitutional limits. The use of emergency declarations to bypass Congress has become routine across administrations. IEEPA for tariffs. The National Emergencies Act for border wall funding. Executive orders on immigration that circumvent legislative authority. This ruling is part of a larger judicial pushback against that trend.
And what's striking is that the pushback is coming from a court that is generally sympathetic to executive power. This tells you how far the pendulum has swung. When even a conservative supermajority says the executive has overstepped, that is a significant marker. The question is whether it represents a genuine course correction or just a speed bump on the road to ever-expanding presidential authority.
And that brings us to the money. $175 billion in potentially illegally collected tariffs. Let's put that in perspective. That is more than the annual budget of most federal agencies. It's roughly equivalent to what the federal government spends on education and transportation combined. That money was taken from American businesses and consumers under an authority that the Supreme Court has now said didn't exist. The question of restitution is going to be one of the most consequential fiscal issues the government faces in the coming years.
The litigation is going to be extraordinary. We're going to see class action lawsuits, individual business claims, trade association challenges. Law firms are already gearing up. Some estimates suggest the legal proceedings could take years to resolve and could ultimately cost the federal government far more than the original tariff revenue when you factor in damages, interest, and legal costs. This is a fiscal time bomb.
And here's something that hasn't gotten enough attention: the impact on federal revenue projections. The tariffs were generating significant revenue for the federal government. That revenue was baked into budget projections and spending plans. If those tariffs are now void and the government faces massive refund obligations, that creates a double hit to the federal budget: lost future revenue and liability for past collections. Somebody is going to have to pay for that, and historically, that somebody is the taxpayer.
Which is a deeply ironic outcome. American consumers and businesses paid inflated prices because of the tariffs. Now, as taxpayers, they may end up paying again to fund the legal settlements and refunds. It's a lose-lose for ordinary Americans, and it was entirely avoidable if the proper constitutional process had been followed from the beginning.
Let's also discuss what this means for the concept of emergency powers more broadly. The IEEPA ruling could have ripple effects beyond trade policy. If the court is signaling that emergency declarations cannot be used to exercise powers that belong to Congress, that principle could be applied to other contexts. Immigration enforcement funded through emergency declarations. Environmental regulations imposed by executive order. Military deployments authorized without congressional approval. The legal framework established by this ruling has implications far beyond tariffs.
That's the big picture story here, and it's one that should concern, or encourage, people regardless of their political affiliation. If you believe in constitutional governance, in the separation of powers, in the idea that major policy decisions should be made by elected representatives through a deliberative process, this ruling is a vindication of those principles. It says that the president is not a king, that emergency powers have limits, and that the Constitution still means something.
But we should also be realistic about the limitations of judicial rulings. Courts can declare actions illegal, but they can't force compliance in real time. They can't prevent future presidents from testing the same boundaries. And they can't address the underlying political dysfunction that makes emergency governance attractive in the first place: a Congress that is often too gridlocked, too partisan, and too risk-averse to do its job.
That is the uncomfortable truth at the center of this story. Presidents reach for emergency powers because Congress won't act. And Congress won't act because the political incentives favor posturing over legislating. Until that dynamic changes, we're going to keep seeing executive overreach followed by judicial correction followed by political finger-pointing. It's a cycle that serves no one except the lawyers and the pundits.
And speaking of serving no one, let's talk about what this has done to American credibility on the world stage. For years, the United States has lectured other countries about the rule of law, about respecting institutional boundaries, about the importance of stable and predictable governance. And then we imposed hundreds of billions of dollars in tariffs through a legal mechanism that our own Supreme Court has now said was unlawful. How do you go to a trade negotiation with that on your record?
It's a credibility crisis, plain and simple. And it's not just about trade. When allies and adversaries alike see the United States government operating outside its own legal framework, it undermines the entire international order that the United States helped build. It gives authoritarian governments an easy talking point: the Americans don't even follow their own rules. Rebuilding that credibility is going to take years of consistent, lawful governance.
Now, as we bring this home, I want to emphasize something for our viewers. This story is not over. This ruling is the beginning of a new chapter, not the end of the book. There will be appeals, there will be legislative responses, there will be new tariff proposals under different legal authorities. The politics of trade are not going away. But the legal landscape has fundamentally shifted, and that shift matters.
It matters because it reaffirms a basic principle, that in a constitutional republic, power has limits. The president is powerful, but not all-powerful. Emergency authority is broad, but not unlimited. And when those limits are exceeded, the courts will act. That's how the system is supposed to work, even when it's messy, even when it's slow, even when the outcome creates its own problems.
And the human cost of this saga cannot be overlooked. Behind the legal arguments and the budget numbers are real people. The factory worker whose job disappeared when retaliatory tariffs shut down export markets. The small business owner who couldn't absorb a 30% cost increase and had to close shop. The farmer who watched crops rot because trade relationships collapsed overnight. These stories are real, and they deserve to be at the center of this conversation.
Absolutely. And those are the people who should be first in line when restitution is discussed. Not the large corporations with armies of lawyers who can navigate the claims process. Not the politically connected industries that got carve-outs and exceptions. The small businesses and working families who bore the brunt of this policy deserve to be made whole, and it's going to take political will and moral courage to make that happen.
So what should you, our viewers, be watching for in the coming weeks and months? First, watch for the administration's response. Will they accept the ruling, seek workarounds, or attempt to reimpose tariffs through alternative authorities? Second, watch Congress. Will they step up and reassert their constitutional trade authority, or will they punt and leave the issue to the courts? Third, watch the litigation. The first wave of lawsuits seeking tariff refunds will tell us a lot about the scope and speed of financial restitution.
And fourth, watch the prices. If tariffs are rolled back, consumer prices should eventually come down on affected goods. If they don't, that tells you something about corporate pricing behavior and whether companies are using the tariff rollback as a windfall rather than passing savings to consumers. Follow the money, as always. The money tells the real story.
That's the Truth Report. One Supreme Court ruling. $175 billion in question. One fundamental constitutional principle reaffirmed. And millions of Americans waiting to see whether the system can actually deliver justice, not just legal opinions.
We'll be following every development. This story has layers that will unfold for months, possibly years. The legal, economic, and political ramifications of this ruling will be studied in law schools and economics departments for decades. It's a defining moment for the separation of powers in the 21st century.
If you found this reporting valuable, share it. Talk about it. Stay informed. In a media environment saturated with noise, understanding the substance of rulings like this is how citizens hold their government accountable. That's not partisan. That's patriotic.
And remember, the Constitution doesn't enforce itself. It requires an informed public, an independent judiciary, and a press willing to dig into the details rather than just chase headlines. That's what we try to do here at Truth Report, and that's what we'll keep doing.
For Truth Report, I'm Alex Truth.
And I'm Maya Clarity.
Stay vigilant. Stay informed. And never stop asking the hard questions. We'll see you next time.